16 June 1915, Lance Corporal Austin Frank Broughton, Northumberland Fusiliers, and Lieutenant Adolph Berry of the Reserve Infantry Regiment 246 are both killed on the same day. To find out more about what happened on that day, we went to the research center of the Memorial Museum Passchendaele 1917 at Zonnebeke. It is just next to the church of the village that has a preserved World War I dugout underneath it. Here we met with the curator of the MMP 1917, Steven van den Busche, and scientific researcher Lee Ingelbrecht. It seems we had run into the story about the first Battle of Bellewaarde that happened on 16 June 1915, one of the many battles in the Ypres area, completely forgotten due to the much larger battles in the Salient, such as the 2nd and 3rd Ypres. Armed with photos, maps from the war period and locations of what is left of the battlefield today, between the villages of Geluved and Hellfire Corner at Ypres, we could start our journey into World War I history. But first we had an appointment with the education officer Christoph Blick from the same museum, where they have also recreated some of the different trenches from the 1915-1918 period. A very good start to see how the trenches and trench warfare had changed throughout the war, a subject that is very often forgotten. In the reconstructed trenches of the museum, you travel from 1915 to 1918, visiting British and German trenches from the front line, and also communication trenches, mortar positions, small dugouts, which give the visitor a very good idea about the various construction methods. Can you tell us something about the evolution of the trenches in 1914?
Well, eventually, in the beginning of the war, no one was expecting a trench warfare, of course. And they started to make small ditches, what we call foxholes. Of course, there was a stalemate position, so they decided to deep out these foxholes, and it became, slowly they became trenches. The first trenches weren't at all like we know the trenches nowadays in studies. They were actually just modified ditches. And you can see by the pictures of Christmas 1914 that they were actually full of mud and water. There was no fortification on the sides. There was no wicker work or plank boards holding up the earth. And this modification of these ditches actually started only in the beginning of 1915. You can really talk about trenches like we know them from the beginning of 1915 on. And also there was actually in the beginning a shortage of sandbags, of Hessian. So if you look to the early pictures of 1915 and 1914 winter, you actually can see they use all kinds of cloth to make sandbags. You can actually see pillow covers and use as sandbags. They can have all sorts of colors. There was no real camouflage meaning of it. And slowly they started to use more and more sandbags. That became a problem for the Germans because Hessian was basically made in colonies from England, and Germany didn't have the supplies for the sources to make Hessian, so that became a big problem for them. And if you see the evolution of the trenches, in 1915 the Germans make decent trenches with wooden boards like this and sandbags, and later in the war the sandbags disappear. They use more and more earthworks or even use wickerwork and all kinds of stuff to actually strengthen the trench.
Okay. So how did it go then in later years? Was there still a big evolution, or was this a minor evolution?
Well, the negative evolution of the trench for the Germans went on. The Germans were, on the other hand, one of the first ones to realize you needed a drainage system in the trenches. So they made actually drainage systems underneath the wooden boards with little rocks they used, rubble they used, sometimes actually a drainage pipe with holes in it to evacuate the water and pump it out. Fortunately for the Germans, they were mostly on higher grounds, so that was easy to pump the water out. For the British Army, it was a different story. They were on the mostly marsh pits of the area, so they had big water issues. And in the evolution, you see the Germans are using drainage systems, but the British actually invented the A-frame trench. It was revolutionary for were then, and there was actually a reversed A, where you could put duckboards on, and the sides were strengthened by corrugated iron. A luxury the Germans didn't have, because they were lacking metal and all sorts of stuff. Yeah. With the lacking of metal, decent wooden planks, and also sandbags, you see also the German trenches evolves to a wickerwork trench with actually earth dug up and thrown on the parapet and parados, and they used that as a strengthified position. Of course, you may not forget that from 1917 on, only the front line was actually a real trench. If we talk about defensive lines like Flanders 1, Flanders 2, there were no trenches there. And the Germans more and more developed a system where they used the shell holes from the enemy, made by the enemy shells, to actually make trenches of it by connecting them. So that's how they trained it, and they actually were very creative in that, to connect the shell holes and make a decent trench out of that. And they could, well, have a very fast and easy trench for that. In the British trenches, we can say the actually modification of the trenches started after the Battle of the Somme. It was still a strong belief in British lines and British staff that trenches were temporary. They needed to advance, they needed to attack, so there was not real consolidation of the ground with good trenches. They actually made trenches temporarily. In 1917 that changed definitely in Flanders, because they couldn't stand anymore the water and the complete problem with mud they had here. So then the trenches were actually very well made. Corrugated iron, A-frames, sandbagging, and they became better than German trenches. The only biggest problem the British still had was that they did it too proper. The Germans soon discovered that if you make a straight line of sandbagging on top, every silhouette of popping out, any observer looking over the parapet would be very, very noticeable for the enemy. So the Germans made their trench a little bit more, well, full of rubbish and debris, so to distract the form of the trench. The British trenches were very flat and narrow, and they had to actually instruct soldiers to make it more chaotic, just to cover up their observation posts. And the Germans actually from 1917 on didn't do any efforts more for building proper trenches and set on the front line. And the British were very surprised by that when they came and consolidated German grounds in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. What they found were shell holes, no trenches, and they were not prepared for that. So that's why a lot of engineers had to go very, very near the front line and actually fought and dug on the front line themselves. And a lot of engineers died in the Battle of Passchendaele also because they needed to make trenches. There were no trenches there. And that's a big difference. And you can see there was a delay in the British Army. Eventually he had a better trench, but in the beginning you can say the German trench was much better than the British trench.
Okay, how about taking shelter?
Well, that was the same problem. Originally, no one was actually thinking about spending months and months and months in trenches. So shelters were very primitive. There was actually a prohibition of actually digging in the sides of the trench, because otherwise you would make the complete structure of the trench very weak. So you couldn't dig a hole in the side of the trench. That makes it a very problem, because then you have no place to shelter. So soon the Germans started to build little dugouts on the sides of the trenches, and after a time also the British did, and they just ignored the order of not digging in the sides of the trench. And what was first a very small hole became bigger and bigger and bigger, just until we know about like things like we call dugouts. Yeah. Those really some stairs deep, not deep dugouts. Don't confuse them with deep dugouts, who are sometimes 10 meters and more deeper, but little dugouts who could host like 10 soldiers or a few officers, and who were protected with a layer of earth, sometimes steel rods, bricks, everything they found. It was, let's call it bomb-proof. Later in the war, they actually used corrugated iron, and they heaped earth on it or sandbagging, and they could make shelter-proof shelters, bomb-proof shelters like that.
From here, we would go and visit another very interesting museum in the area, constructed on the location of the First Battle of Bellewaarde, where we met with Nick Benoot, the curator and owner of this private museum. Nick, kan je iets meer vertellen over Hooge als gehucht voor de oorlog?
Ja, dus Hooge was eigenlijk een heel mooie gehucht, een van de prachtigste van de streek, zegt men. Men spreekt al van het Hooge eigenlijk rond het jaar 1300. En dat komt eigenlijk vooral door het Bellewaarde park en het Bellewaarde kasteel toen die tijd, het kasteel van het Hooge. Hoe komt dat? Er was een heel mooi park, een heerlijkheid van 32 hectare. Dat was eigenlijk het mooiste van de provincie. En het had één sterke aantrekkingspunt. Dat was een boom, een hele dikke eik, een oude eik, met een omtrek van 5,80 meter. Dus dat was iets enorm. En iedereen kwam kijken naar die eik. Dus in die tijd was er nog niet zoveel om te zien. Ja. Maar de dikke eik was toch een hele bijzonderheid. Nu, vanaf het jaar 1800, komt het kasteel in handen van familie Mergeling, die ook dan een adellijke familie was vanuit Ypres. En een taal van de Mergeling-familie trouwt met de familie De Vink uit Antwerpen afkomstig. Deze familie komt hier zich vestigen op het Hooge en woonde in het prachtige kasteel, zoals je hier achter ons kan zien. Een kasteel van het Hooge had een hevelengte van 100 meter. Dat was heel gekend voor een van de mooiste kastelen van de streek. Die familie De Vink vestigt zich hier op het Hooge en bouwt heel wat dingen uit. Zoals een boerderij op het eiland van Bellewaarde kasteel, een boerderij achterin het Bellewaarde farm tijdens de oorlog. En eigenlijk al het personeel van het kasteel begint zich rond het kasteel te vestigen. Daardoor krijg je eigenlijk meer een dorp dan een gehucht, het Hooge. Dus allemaal de gebouwtjes rond het kasteel. Nu, in 1914, toen de oorlog naderde, hadden de Engelsen eigenlijk beslist, de Engelse generale staf, om hun hoofdkwartier daar te vestigen. Omdat de oorlog toen nog ver weg was. En hadden ze eigenlijk nooit gedacht dat eigenlijk het Hooge eigenlijk een middelpunt ging zijn in de Yperboog van de gevechten. En zo ook gezegd aan baron De Vink, kijk, we zullen heel goed voor uw kasteel zorgen, maar mogen wij hier ons hoofdkwartier vestigen. En dit akkoord hebben ze gesloten tussen beide partijen. Nu, eind oktober 1914, beslist daar anders over en het kasteel is dan eigenlijk de eerste maal in de aanval geweest.
The German army had already taken out the fortresses of Willems and Katelijne-Waver, Koningshout, Lier, Kessel in the Antwerp area. By 6 October 1914 they had also taken the Buchram fortress, and the outside belt of fortifications were largely penetrated by the German army, forcing the Belgians to give up the remaining fortresses that were mostly destroyed by the Belgian army itself. The German army closed up to Antwerp itself and bombed the city late in the evening of the 7th October. But meanwhile, German cavalry had already penetrated into the West Flanders area. The story goes that the German army never occupied Ypres, but reality tells us a very different story. In 1914, the cavalry was still very important on both sides as it is in the first months of the war. It remained a very mobile war. On 6 October, some German cavalry units had arrived at Bellingham south of Kortrijk or Courtrai, where they halted for a bivouac. The next day, on 7th October 1914, they continued and halted at Geluved for a large reconnaissance of the eastern area of Ypres. These were the Dragonenregiment Freiherr von Manteuffel No. 5 and the Husarenregiment Landgraf Friedrich II von Hessen-Hamburg No. 14. They were with the 22nd Cavalry Brigade, part of the 3rd German Cavalry Division, and would occupy the city of Ypres in the afternoon, leaving it the next day again to continue the journey into France. It would be the first and the last time German soldiers were to enter Ypres in World War I. The first British soldiers to arrive in Ypres were men of the 4th Corps and General Rawlinson of the 7th Division and 3rd Cavalry Division on 14 October 1914. There they made contact with French troops of the 87th Territorial Division who were already in the town.
We're in the village of Geluved, which is about 6 kilometers from the town of Ypres. The fighting came here in mid-October 1914. The British expeditionary force was on its way from moving up from the River Aisne in France into Flanders. A British corps consisting of 7th Division and the 3rd Cavalry Division was withdrawing from the Antwerp direction where it had been sent a few days before. The British briefly dug in this area before being ordered into an offensive towards Menin and the bridges over the river Lys. But intelligence hadn't told British High Command that they were advancing into an overwhelmingly larger enemy that was advancing in this very direction. The clash began on the 20th of October and developed into one of the epics of the Great War that we now know as the First Battle of Ypres. It lasted until the 11th of November and is remembered as being the most important battle for the British Old Contemptibles, the regulars that had gone out in 1914. Geluved is the critical point in the battle, the critical place and the critical event. Geluved sits on the edge of a piece of high ground, a plateau that stretches towards Ypres. Possession of that plateau gives the army that is on the high ground a wonderful advantage of observation across towards Ypres. It was vital ground to hold. The fighting here was intense and had been in progress for 10 days before Geluved really becomes the centre of everything that was happening. By the 31st of October, the German pressure on the BEF was such that virtually all British reserves had been used up, and it was the last line of defence that was trying to hold Geluved here. 31st of October, the critical day when the German forces almost broke through. Had they broken through Geluved on that day, the way was open to Ypres. We're at the chateau at Geluved. Beautiful building these days, rebuilt after it was completely destroyed in the First World War. This is the scene of one of the turning points of the war. On the 31st of October 1914, the British Army here was crumbling. It had been under such huge pressure for several days that units were tired and depleted. The German army was on the brink of a breakthrough towards Ypres. Reports came into the British High Command that Geluved and the chateau were in German hands. There were no reserves to send to stop the gap, except for some depleted battalions that were some distance away. The 2nd Worcestershire Regiment and the 1st South Wales Borderers fought a notable action here. The 2nd Worcesters advancing with the bayonet to recapture the grounds of Geluved Chateau. It came as a surprise to the Germans. They believed there were no British reserves. It gave the British a morale boost, and it temporarily recaptured this important ground. After their disappointment at the failure to break through at Geluved on the 31st of October, the German 4th Army reorganised to continue the battle. Fighting continued for several days, with a particular flare-up near Zillebeke on the 6th and 7th of November. But the climax of the first battle came on the 11th of November, with fighting in the area of Polygon Wood that was only stopped by a courageous counterattack at Nonnebosken. Shortly after that, the British High Command decided to withdraw and shorten the line in certain areas, and they withdrew back to here, to the line through Veldhoek on the Melin Road near Herenthaler Chateau.
Earlier, on 21 October, the British General Piers Sirocolt had already been heavily wounded at Herenthaler by shell fire at Herenthaler Chateau. He was with the 2nd Battalion King's Royal Rifle Corps, part of the 2nd Brigade, 1st Division of the BEF. Later, Brigadier General Lord Edward Gleichen would also stay here until 20 November, commanding the 15th Infantry Brigade. On 7 November, 2 brothers were killed at Herenthaler, Alfred and William Cogan of the 1st Battalion Bedfordshire Regiment. After the fighting at Nonnebosken, the front line was stabilized more or less in the area of Herenthaler and Veldhoek Wood and continue in this direction towards Polygon Wood. A large part of this area would be held by several French regiments. We are at Herenthaler Wood, actually in the middle of the trenches of the late 1914. Very well known are the Christmas truces in other parts of the front line, but there actually was also one at Herenthaler. I quote from the war diary of Lieutenant Maurice Laurentin, Régiment d'Infanterie 77, Christmas 1914. Here in Geluved. Don't shoot, they say to each other. We show ourselves. We laugh, we make gestures. Come over here. They throw packs of cigarettes. We throw oranges and apples. A few men come to pick up the fruit that fell in front of our trenches. We're waving with a bottle. A blonde, sturdy German rushes to eat everything we give him. Soon over 20 of them came out of the trenches, so we don't have to hide anymore either. 2 Germans come closer. One of them says we have to come to them. The other one, all of a sudden, shouts, "I'm tired of it!" and he jumps into our trench. There he explains, "I'm from the Alsace and I'm joining you." He was with the 126th German Infantry Regiment. This event actually may have had some consequences, which were very probably hidden in the story that was told to us by Oberleutnant Albrecht Ludwig Volz from the 8th Württembergische Infanterieregiment 126. He mentioned in his diary the fact that he was opposite the French at Geluved. He seemed to be happy about one fact on Christmas 1914. In his diary, he said that a group of French officers were making small talk and smoking cigarettes a few hundred meters behind their line, walking around in an open spot in the wood. He observed them for some time and then he took a decision. He found their behavior unfitting to the situation and he said he corrected this by getting a machine gun that opened fire on them. Due to this, the Christmas peace or Christmas truce came to a fast end. Volz seems to have been ahead for a stranger in civilian life. The French Régiment d'Infanterie 290 came from the region of the city of Nancy. They were holding part of the front lines in between Polygonwood and the Eminent Road, close to the Veldhoek and Herenthagen chateaus in early 1915. From this period, an album has survived from a sergeant from this unit. These images say so much more than words.
We're at the chateau at Hooge on the Ypres to Menin road, which became a central part of the Ypres battlefront for the rest of the war. This had been used as a divisional headquarters during the early part of the First Battle of Ypres. The building behind me is a rebuilt version. The original one was a larger and more ornate building, but completely destroyed in the war. When the fighting was at its peak on the 31st of October, the building contained the staff of 2 British divisions, but was hit by a long-range heavy German shell, which killed and wounded a number of those staff officers and really had an important effect on British communications during the battle. When the British later in the battle decided to withdraw the front line closer to Hooge, it ceased to be used for such an important headquarters and eventually became part of the front line itself. The fighting here was relentless for some months, close in for the buildings and the stables of the chateau itself. Eventually, mine warfare started here, tunneling below the buildings of the chateau that eventually accumulated with the blowing of the first of a series of mines on the 6th of June 1915.
There were several other chateaus in this area, and needless to say that none of them would survive the war. One of them at Geluved was a Hooge chateau. It served as a headquarters during the war for the Germans for a very long time until it was completely destroyed during the Third Ypres battle. One of the locations where a lot of improvised shelters were constructed, mostly from wood and dirt by the French soldiers, was Polygon Wood. This was a former shooting range of the Belgian army with the famous butt, which had shelters dug into it.